Okay, it's 3 o'clock. Time for the work session on the first half of the budget presentation. We have here Councilmember Carey and Vice Mayor Parker in here right now. Yeah, it looks like we have Councilmember Nelson by Zoom. So we'll go ahead and get this started, and I'll turn everything over to Ms. Queen.
Thank you, Mayor Whitney. I'm joined here at the podium with Finance Director Imholt, and we'll be going through the bulk of the budget presentation today. We'll be covering the general fund, and we do have department heads with us. So we'll first give the big broad overview of the significant changes in this year's biennial operating budget for fiscal years 24 and 25. And then we'll go through each department, and if there's specific questions to those department budgets, we'll invite the department head up to come speak to those themselves. So we've got 2 days planned. Today's work session, as I mentioned, we'll go through all the highlights and we'll cover the general fund. Tomorrow, we'll start with non-departmentals. So those 4 nonprofits that have been funded by the council in our operating budget will be making their presentation directly to the mayor and council. And then we will transition into the other funds. So utility fund, airport equipment replacement, et cetera. I'll start by just flipping through the document. At the beginning, it lists the principal officers for the city and has a copy of our organization chart. So that's a good reference for people to see how we're organized as a municipality, as well as handy information there about all of their elected officials. Next, we have a table of contents, and that'll just help organize people to navigate this budget document. I think Melanie does a good job of producing a document that's very straightforward, easy to find answers, but this table of contents is a good way to orient yourself to the document. And when we do print the final budget document, we'll have tabs that'll be on the hard copy version, so it'll make it even easier for people to flip through. But I'd like to start the presentation on page I of the document, which is the overview letter that Melanie and I prepare every year that really covers all of the budget highlights. And I'm going to spend some time going through this document in detail. And I would also encourage folks who want one location to go through to be able to reference what's in this document. How does it differ from prior years? This letter is a good place to get a lot of information in one place. I'll begin by just saying, I appreciate Melanie's hard work and all the department heads in pulling together the budget. This year, there were some interesting challenges from a fiscal perspective, including incorporating new costs related to the Fieldhouse debt service. That's a pretty significant change in the budget. As you know, inflationary pressure was pretty significant in 2022. So that impacted not just our salary schedule, but also things like contracted services, materials and supplies, small tools and equipment. So as we go through those, you'll see kind of repetitively again and again, adjustments related to just the costs of goods and services. So we're subject to those same inflationary pressures as everyone else in the community is. We also incorporated some of the changes from the recruitment retention strategy. We'll be sure to point those out when we get to those items in the budget. But overall, I'm really proud of how this came together. It's a balanced budget. We presented a budget where the general fund and the other funds will maintain a strong financial position for the city moving forward, even with the addition of the new projects and some of the new expenses that we are going to experience in the upcoming fiscal year. As I mentioned, this budget is biennial. This is now the second time that we've done a biennial budget. So we've been 2 years into this process. This is the first time we're coming back to you and starting with a new 2-year budget. Overall, I think the process has gone really well for the city from our perspective. Melanie, do you have comments on that or anything to add?
I think it's gone very well. I think the second year of the biennium, saves a lot of time. So, yeah.
So last year we spent a lot of time reorganizing the document because it was the first time we had built it. This year, it's just updating it for the financial pieces. So I think that's been a success from our perspective. As I mentioned, it covers 2 fiscal years, the fiscal year beginning July 1st of 2023 and the fiscal year starting July 1st of 2024. And per our code, the administration comes back in between, so about a year from now for that mid-biennium review. there are times where we'll reference, there's some things not changed in the second year of this budget because we would anticipate that would be done during the mid-biennium review. So we'll call those out as we go.
Question. As you've gone through this now for a couple of years, do you find it easier now to have a biannual budget? Easier to plan ahead? From the department standpoint, the feelings on a biannual budget?
We might get feedback. I'll just be sensitive to whether we get any feedback from that microphone as we make that change. I think it was a good 2-year period to test this new process because we did see more significant changes than normal in terms of the cost of goods rising. And yet I don't think that we felt restricted from coming to the council and, for example, getting additional funds for snow clearing. So we hadn't predicted that big snow year. And we had large inflationary pressures, but overall we were able to work within the budget that was adopted. So I think it's a success. As Melanie mentioned, 1 year ago, we spent a lot less time developing a big document, scheduling meetings, and we're able to just focus on those things like cost of living adjustment, insurance rate changes. That really streamlined the process and kind of the level of administrative work internally. So I think it's been a successful transition. So I'm now on page I on the letter, and I'll like to start just with revenues. As you know, sales tax is the single largest revenue source for the city, other than grant funding, and it represents about 85% of the revenue in the general fund. For FY24, we're projecting $10,295,000 in sales tax revenue, and we feel that that's a realistic yet conservative estimate. I will point out that it's noteworthy. This is the first time that we have budgeted more than 10 million in sales tax revenue. 2022 was the first year that the city experienced sales tax revenue over 9 million. The year before was the first year we were over 8 million. So we'd seen strong sales tax revenue growth in the recent years, even during the pandemic. Part of that is also due to more online sales tax coming online. And I'll show you the breakdown of this 10,295,000 we're projecting for the upcoming fiscal year. About just over 90% of that is local brick and mortar businesses. So we're projecting 9,512,000 from local businesses. And that's based on where we think we're going to be in the current year by the end of the year, plus 2%. That's how we made our projection for next year. So we looked at where we are, all the data we have to date, where are we going to be with local brick and mortar businesses, and add 2%. So that's why we feel comfortable saying that that's a conservative estimate. But that 9.5 million is about 91% of all of our sales tax revenue. The remainder is internet sales that are collected by the Remote Seller Sales Tax Commission. And we're projecting those to come in around 783,000 for FY24. That estimate is based on where we think we're going to be in the current year, plus 25% increase. So that's a bigger increase. We're still seeing faster growth in internet sales because more retailers are still signing onto the program. We've not yet captured all of the internet retailers that are out there, and the team at AML that administers that service continue to be proactive in signing up new businesses so that they're now collecting and remitting that sales tax. So that's why our estimate for internet sales is anticipated to grow by 25%.
Are we seeing an increase also in the charge from the internet sales tax group?
Thank you, Mayor Whitney. We are. So the rate that we pay is a percentage of the revenue that's collected. So as our revenue continues to grow, so too will the amount we need to appropriate for those fees for them to be collected. But the fees are also set on a tiered structure where statewide, when we pass certain thresholds as a state, that rate drops down within a current calendar year. So it's true that as our revenues increase, we'll be paying more in fees. It's also true that as a state, we're seeing our rate decline earlier in the year because we're passing those statewide thresholds earlier in the year. Thank you. For FY '25, we have just included a 2% increase across the board from FY '24. That's for all sales tax. That's probably conservative, and it's the kind of thing that would be revisited during the mid-biennium adjustment. At that point, the city will have much more sales tax data. And so I anticipate that the FY '25 number is one of those items that we would adjust and bring back a recommended revision next year, 1 year from now.
Just a comment. So again, 2 years ago was 8 for the first time, and 9 million, and now it's 10. And so again, you're saying a year later, it'll only be up to, again, 10.5. So probably maybe a $500,000 wiggle room in there. At least in looking at the last couple of years. $1 million increase.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Carey. I'd say that generally that's true, but the last 2 years were a little bit unusual. We saw larger increases than we had historically. So we're still a little bit cautious about looking at the experience of the last 2 years and projecting that forward. For a long time, I think we were budgeting sales tax revenue in the range of about 2% a year. That was separate from the online sales, but that was what we had experienced traditionally and we're pretty comfortable with.
Sure.
But to your point, yeah, it might be an increase in revenue for FY '25 when we come back a year from now.
So maybe the larger amount is actually the new norm.
Yeah, thank you. The next section is property tax, not a big increase here. This is just based on an increase in the assessed value that the borough assigns to all land within the city, which they increased by just under 6% for FY '24. So we are, if you turn the page, FY '24, we're budgeting $355,000 for property taxes collected within the city, and that includes small amount for personal property and motor vehicle tax. I'll just note this budget proposes no change to the city's current mill rate of 0.5 mils and no change to the sales tax rate of 3%. And just for educational value, those rates have been consistent for quite a long time. So the 3% sales tax was actually voter approved in 1984. So it's been 3% since 1984 when the voters increased it from 2 to 3%. Our mill rate has not increased since 1983. In fact, the council has decreased it 6 times during that period, but we've been at 0.5 mils for quite a few years now. We're just holding steady at that mill rate, and this budget proposes no change to either.
On the property tax increase, that's mainly an assessed value, or is it an even split between new construction or new assessments?
We can get that data for you. We don't have it with us, but perhaps we can get together tomorrow morning and see if we can get that in time for the work session tomorrow. You have your packet. The last mill rate increase was the last mill rate increase was 1983. And it was reduced several years in a row. And I don't have that document in front of me that shows when we landed on 0.5. It's within the last 10 years, but I'd have to go back and get that in my notes.
I'm thinking it's about 8 years. What my recollection is. I think it changed right after I got on the council, got down to the half.
Thank you for those questions. The next revenue section we cover in the letter is interest. This is the earnings on the city's investments that are handled by Alaska Permanent Capital Management. And we are projecting interest of $940,000 in FY '24 and $860,000 in FY '25. Those are based on the estimated value of all of our investments. And we apply an estimated rate of return that is given to us by our our financial managers. So they have projected a rate of return of 4.6 for FY '24 and 4.7 for FY '25. The FY '25 number in terms of revenue is a slight decrease. That's because we asked them to assume that some amount of fund balance was pulled out of our fund balance for the field house project. So the council has not yet authorized us to use any of the city's general funds for that project. But as part of our investment presentation they gave a few weeks ago, and in terms of budgeting, we asked them to assume that $3 million was used from our fund balance for that project. So that impacts the revenue they project in FY '25.
The $10 million bond issue that we sold, where is that, where are those funds parked?
Those funds will be in the debt service fund. Actually, go ahead, Melanie.
So the payments on those funds are in the debt service fund. We transfer money out of the general fund to the debt service fund for payment on those bonds. The bond issuance, the money coming in and where we're spending the money out of is living in the capital project fund. That is not part of the operating budget.
Okay, so that 10 million that we sold in February, that's sitting somewhere earning interest?
That is in an AMLIP account that's separate just for the bonds.
And that interest, does that show up in this budget anywhere?
It does not.
Will it at some point in time? Or is it just going to,
It is going to be living with the bond issuance because it needs to be spent on the project itself, which is in the capital project fund. This is just operating funds and does not include any of our capital project funds.
any other questions, Mr. Carey?
Just because you mentioned interest, at our Frontier Community Services Board meeting on Wednesday, financial people came in and mentioned to us that CDs have gone from 0.2 up to 4.1, a 20 times increase. And you just talked about in terms of expecting more interest off of funds. But today at Credit Union One, Credit Union, I went in, exact same thing, switched my CDs from a 0.2% increase to a 4.0% increase. So from basically 22, whatever. Are we, I'm assuming you monitor what's happening on interest with all the federal increases, but if CDs for, I'm going to say common people have gone from, point something to 4 point, I would have to assume that public money also has an increasing interest. I mean, that's a very huge, you can only do it for a 1 year period of time. It's locked, that new CD is for a 12-month period, but it will roll over in 12 months at whatever the rate is. But I'm just wondering right now, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a very significant increase in the interest paid. And I'm just wondering, does our funds that we have somehow get to take advantage of what's happening right now in the nation?
So that's something that we pay Alaska Permanent Capital Management to advise on, and
Right.
they manage those funds. And as those changes happen, they move our money where it needs to go to take advantage of situations like that. So that's not something that we pay attention to at our level. It's something that we pay them to administer.
Sure. But obviously you have the availability of calling them and asking them about things. I would be interested just to know in terms of what impact that's going to have. I mean, that's a very significant change in interest rates. And so I'd be interested just as we look at where we do put our funds for the city, a very significant increase would be something I'd hope we could take advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you. The next portion of this letter shifts from revenues to expenditures. And first off, we want to talk about cost of living adjustment. We track Alaska Urban CPI, which is a metric that it's data based on the cost of a bundle of goods. And it's reported by the federal government monthly, but we typically look at the prior year. So for the budget that we're building, we will look at the calendar year 2022 in terms of looking at inflationary impacts on the cost of goods and services. That metric, Alaska Urban, is representative of not just Anchorage, but communities like ours. So it's the best data available that tells us what are expenses doing in terms of buying power. And last year was really an outlier. So 8.1% for 2022 is the highest that COLA has been, or excuse me, cost of living has risen since 1981. And if you remember in Alaska, early 80s were pretty scary. There was some strange things happening in the markets. So it was a significant change. Looking at the years prior to that, I think the average over year to year was closer to 2.5%. So we'd have many years where it's close to zero, a couple of years where it's in the threes, but on average, 2.5% is what we've been looking at the decade prior to last year. We like to pay close attention to this metric because it impacts our expenses. Think costs are rising for us. It also impacts just cost of living expenses for our employees. And when we set wages and salary and benefits, it's one of a couple important things we consider because we want to keep employees whole in terms of letting their wages keep track with inflation. So we also need to consider wages of the marketplace. So we look around at our peer organizations, we look at the AML salary survey, and we compare what similar positions are being paid here at the city versus other positions in other municipalities. What we built into this budget, I think, is a reasonable and strategic approach to dealing with a year where we have very, very high inflation. And this is a solution that we actually thought of a year ago when we were negotiating with PSEA. We knew that we were going to be in a year coming up that had significant inflationary cost rises. So what we proposed in this budget includes a 4.5% increase to the entire salary schedule. That's true of the represented members in the PSEA bargaining unit, as well as the non-represented employees. So we have two separate salary schedules, and we'll go over them both. But this budget builds in a 4.5% cost of living adjustment to the salary schedule. So every year from here on out, they'll receive essentially what it was this year, a 4.5% raise. In addition, we budgeted for a 3.5% lump sum payment, which would be 3.5% of the base pay for employees. So these two together get them close this year to keeping them whole with inflationary pressure. However, in my opinion, it's a much more prudent approach rather than raising wages across the entire table 8.1%. The cost of living adjustment is not the only increase that people get in their salaries. They also have normal steps. So if you're on the steps, let me get to the salary schedule real quick. Steps A through I on our schedule is a 2% increase every year. After that, you move 2% every 2 years. So we adjust the entire salary schedule for cost of living. People also move forward as they get more seniority, as they advance in their career. That also increases their wages. And Melanie and I did a look back. We did a 10-year look back to see are our salaries for employees tracking with inflation. And in fact, we're exceeding those costs, which is where we want to be, because as I mentioned, we want to reward people for advancing in their career, tenure, gaining professional experience. For the 10 years prior to this budget, our employees' wages exceeded inflation by about 8%. And that's consistent with some statewide data that shows just average wages in the state outpacing inflation. So that puts us in, I think, a good position to provide wage for people that keeps them whole as cost of goods and services goes up, while also letting them grow within the organization in terms of their salary and benefits. I'll pause and ask if there are questions about that.
Yes, quick question on the cost of living. So as I'm reading this, it's going to be a 4.5% cost of living adjustment, and then an additional 3.5% lump sum payment based on the current level, meaning if they were at level A, they're going to get 3.5% of whatever that level was. And then the 4.5% was, how's that going to fit in? Based on the new or the old?
So so effective July 1, everyone's salary will increase by 4.5%, because on July 1, the effective date of this new budget year, the entire salary schedule will adjust. So whichever step you are, you'll get that increase to your annual salary right away. We would intend to pay out the lump sum in September. So depending on where folks are in September, whichever step they are, and some people will have moved between now and then, they would receive that additional 3.5% as a lump sum payment, depending on which step they are at that point in time.
Question on the lump sum. Is that technically a lump sum? If they don't stay with us for the full year, do we get part of that back?
So we discussed the idea of giving it all at once versus giving out, for example, quarterly. It's my recommendation, I think Melanie agrees, that it's okay to give it out all at once. And the reasoning for that is because really we're talking about last year's cost increases. So these are cost increases that everyone has already incurred. I'm comfortable if the council agrees with this approach, just giving that in a single payment. And I'll put a plug in for employees if they're listening. That'd be a great opportunity to invest in your own 457 plan. We can do things like that with these extra lump sum payments. So people can either receive that as taxable income, or they can advise our HR manager to put it into their deferred compensation plan if they wish.
Thank you.
Thank you. So in FY 23, if I had only been an employee for 8 months, that lump sum would just be based on the 8 months that I was with the city?
That's an excellent question. So the lump sum payment will only be for regular employees, so not our temporary seasonal. And when we administer this, Jessica, can you nod yes or no? We would have the ability to prorate it based on your time with us in 2022. That's a smart idea, and we can look into the details.
Okay. And then the chart on Roman numeral page 17, the salary chart, does that reflect the 4.5% increase, or is that based on today?
Thank you. So the salary schedules that are in this book are already reflective of a 4.5% increase. So if you compared them to our current budget book, they've already been adjusted.
Okay, thanks.
And why was the month of September chosen to do that?
I'd have to go back to my notes. The month of September is when we identified that lump sum payment in the PSEA bargaining agreement, but that was over a year ago, as I mentioned. So we were going to mirror the timing and the structure of that. And I don't recall why we selected it for it to be later in the fall. Jessica, any thoughts on that?
Unfortunately, I can see the lips move, but I
Yeah.
can't hear what the
You
volume
have to
is.
repeat what just.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So our HR manager, Jessica Reagan, was saying that we had done that for just practical reasons, the amount of time it takes to administer the payment and calculate all the different rates and make sure that we've got, we don't want to commit to paying on July 1 without making sure that we can commit to that deadline. So it gives us just a little bit of flexibility in time. But the short answer was we just, in terms of this budget, we're contractually obligated for PSEA to pay it in September, excuse me, because that's what was negotiated. And we just mirrored that same timing for the rest of the employees.
Okay, any other questions?
Okay, thank you. The next thing I want to talk about is health insurance. This is an area that we focused on pretty significantly last year because as a member of the state's political subdivision plan, we call it the Poly Sub Plan. We are one of several municipalities that are members of that plan. And traditionally, we'd been experiencing very low premium increases. We even had several years where there were premium holidays, where there were many months within a year where the city and our employees paid nothing for the monthly premiums. But last year we had a significant increase. If you recall, last year we had an increase to our rates of just over 22%. Those rate increases are delivered to us essentially pretty late in the year, typically May. And we then have a renewal that starts July 1. So at that point, we didn't have many options in terms of mitigating it. We can't negotiate directly with Aetna because, as I mentioned, we're one of several members, and our plan, any negotiation or changes is administered by the state of Alaska. So we committed to the council that we would do so, and we spent quite a bit of resources and time working with a health insurance consultant. That was really important because, as you know, it's a very complicated field with a lot of nuance. But we brought on some consultants and they performed some work for us. The first thing they did was develop a benchmarking analysis where they looked at our plan, the specifics of the plan, our deductible rates, our out-of-pocket, whether it's copay or coinsurance, went line by line through our current plan and compared it to those of our peers. So the typical municipalities we look at, Homer, Kenai, Seward, Palmer, Wasilla, the school district, the borough. There's some variances there, especially on the borough side with their self-insurance. But that gave us a lot of data about whether our coverage levels were on par with what our peers are experiencing in their plans, as well as the costs. We took a look at the costs. The other thing that they provided us is somewhat applicable, but there's a large survey of 125 organizations in the Pacific Northwest, and they could then give us the median and the mean, the average of all of these items. So any of those topics I said, whether it's coinsurance rates or deductibles, we now have data on what the kind of Pacific Northwest average is. So that gives us a lot more information than we've ever had in the past. And I think from that work, we were pretty comfortable that in terms of the coverage that we have, it was right where we wanted to be compared to some other of our peers. In terms of cost, one thing that highlighted for me is that some of the other municipalities are taking on more of that cost burden than we were through employees. So right now, we the city pay 90% if you're an employee that selects employee-only coverage. The city pays 90% of your monthly premium and the employee pays 10%. If you elect any other higher level of coverage, it could be employee plus your spouse, it could be employee plus dependents, or it could be all of the above, employee plus spouse and dependent, so full family coverage. If you elect any of those three plans currently in fiscal year 23, the city would pay 80% of your premium and that employer would be responsible for 20%. So that was one area that this benchmarking analysis highlighted for me, some differences between the municipalities, and some of them were taking on more of that cost burden as an organization themselves. So that was important. The other thing we had the consultants do is go out to market, solicit quotes, because I didn't want to be in a position where we were handed rate increases potentially. I'm assuming they would have been rate increases at the time without any other options. And they worked for several weeks over the last actually couple of months. They worked directly as a broker with different health insurance companies. And they delivered the results of those proposals last Wednesday. April 18th, we got the results. So we moved very quickly in terms of what are we going to show in this budget? How do we give ourselves enough time to really think through the details matter? How do we communicate with employees about this change and get preferences? So that work is very much still ongoing, but what we put in the budget would be assuming that we switch away from the Polysub plan to a plan quoted to us by Premera. In terms of our peers, Premera was the most commonly used provider in the area. They provided quotes that are approximately 20% lower than what we are paying right now. And that's in contrast to the quote we got from the Polysub plan, which would see our rates increase just over 8%, 8.1% starting July 1. I was quite taken aback when we saw that. I wasn't expecting that necessarily, but the more we looked into it, we've done a lot of close vetting with our consultants. I'm quite confident that we have a pretty good understanding now of the plan, that it would provide similar coverage to what we have right now. They have a strong network of in-network providers. We've got a list of all of that. And I think it just points to the fact that our current plan is just no longer competitive. And I'll add, there's some difficulty remaining in the Polysub plan, as I mentioned, not being in a more direct position to design it in a way that meets our needs. We're one of many municipalities. We think we're one of the bigger municipalities involved in that plan, but we're heavily impacted by things that happen outside our organization. So we don't yet have good data about our utilization of health insurance. We aren't allowed to have that data as a member of this Polysub plan. If we make a shift moving forward, we'd have much better sense of control over our plan, designing in a way that meets our needs. And so that's what we will be recommending, but that'll be a decision that comes back to the council as a resolution. And we are tentatively looking at the first May meeting to bring that resolution back. Confirming with Jessica that that's what we talked about. Okay. And that gives just a few weeks, very short time frame to have that communication and education with our employees. And we would be leaning on these same health insurance consultants to do a lot of that transition education and communication with employees so that we make sure that everyone gets all their questions answered ahead of that decision that would be coming back to you on May 10th. Let me pause. That's quite a bit of information.
Mr. Carey?
Might it then be correct to analyze that we are maybe subsidizing the others in the group?
Thank you, Mr. Carey, Councilmember Carey. That's a concern I have, and it's a question that will never be answered.
Of course.
Because of the design of this plan, we can never get access to that level of data. In fact, we were not able to get either Aetna or the state to even give us a list of other municipalities participating in the plan. I engaged directly with one because I happened to just overhear at a conference, a conversation, and I reached out to the city of Kodiak directly because I know they're a member of the plan. But other than that, we wouldn't have been able to get access to that information and have these kinds of conversations with those municipalities.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Parker?
Thank you. So in reading the document, if we were to switch from Aetna to Primera, employees, if they adopted a family plan or employee spouse, whatever, their premiums would go from 80% coverage to 85%. So it does provide a benefit to the employees because they're not having to pay as much.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Parker, for that question. So the decision about what percentage we pay as a city belongs with us. So we can actually tailor that any way we want it. This budget does build in that transition, moving from us paying 80 to us, the municipality paying 85%. But that's a policy decision that's at the discretion of the council. But I did bring just for an illustration. So employees, if they've got family coverage currently, their monthly expenses for their portion is $676.51 a month. If we switch to Primera and the city adjusts our portion to that 85%, their rates will go down from $676 a month to $403 a month. That's an annual savings of $3,278. So it's a significant savings to employees as well as a significant savings to the city as a municipality. I think as focusing on the details of the transition and the coverage will be important, but they're similar. And I think that financially it's significant.
Like follow up. So you say you see an overall decrease of 175,000 from the prior year for the insurance budget. That's at the 85%?
Correct. So
Okay,
that number,
And I'm not going to be at the May 10th meeting, but I would recommend that should we make this switch that we go with 85%?
Ms. Hutchins?
Thank you. One of the things I was curious about, Stephanie, I've worked on a lot of insurance plans for employees. And the one thing that I found, we were mostly with Primera, but there were times that they would hit us with a really high increase and we had to go looking. But there was always a clause that you couldn't change for like 3 years. So I didn't know if they had mentioned that to you. I know Aetna pulled that once, if you had just gone with them and then they kicked you up, you would have to stay with them for the 3 years. So I don't know if they still have that, and Primera did have that as well. So you might check.
thank you, Councilmember Hutchins. We will look into that. I will say that even with our current provider through the state poly sub plan, they reserve the right to change our rates if something significant happens, even after the start of the fiscal year. So it's not like other contracts where we get a quoted rate and that rate applies to the whole year. Even within our current plan, say, for example, one of the other municipalities dropped, they're now going to recalculate those rates and we would be stuck with those rates. I'd have to revisit the exit clause, but we will pay close attention to that for the current plan and the proposed different one and bring back that information. Thank you.
Do we have any kind of a guarantee in there that all of a sudden next year we won't see a 40% increase? And do we have a contract with them? Is it over a period of years, like 2 years, 3 years? And last one, would they cover current employees? I can't think of the term now. Yes, pre-existing conditions.
I'll Excellent questions. Maybe I'll start in reverse. So all employees with pre-existing conditions will be covered, even if we switch to a different provider. I don't believe that we would be set up on a multi-year contract. I think the way it'll work will be year to year, where we will be both getting updated rate increases for the upcoming year, whether we stay with our current plan or switch to Premera. I think it's going to be on an annual basis. The one change, and it relates to Councilmember Carey's question, is that if we switch to Premera moving forward, our rate changes would just be based on our experience and not potentially lumped in with other municipalities' experience. But we would anticipate that those would just be adjusted annually. We would renegotiate if we wanted. We could kind of look out at the market. Your first question is one that we've asked several times, and the question was, can there be some guarantee that rates won't go up any certain percentage in any given year? And the answer, I believe, is no. However, with the consultants, we did express this as a concern. I think it's a very natural question. Would someone quote us very low rates, getting us their business, and then maybe in years later, they kind of claw back some of that income through rate increases? And at least the consultants, the brokers we're working with, they don't see that. They look at a lot of data. They look at a lot of year-to-year increases with their clients. If they had concern about that through a certain provider, they wouldn't have brought that quote to our attention. So although it's certainly an area of uncertainty, what would happen in future years, I would say it feels the same level of risk and uncertainty as what we currently have. But we asked the consultants even last week, again, that very question, and they would expect any rate increases in the future to be tied to our experience, our utilization, and not some strategic movement of the rates.
With the current municipalities who may be insured through Premera right now, have we had any contact with them and how their satisfaction is with the coverage?
Sure. So yeah, Melanie reached out to one municipality who uses Premera. Generally, they had not heard concerns from employees about access, availability of providers. But as I mentioned, the devil's in the details. Their plan through Premera is very different than what was quoted us through Premera. So they mentioned, for example, the impact of co-pays, and that's just not something that was quoted in our plan. So really, we were drilling down on having these proposals as closely as possible match our current coverage levels. But we did have conversations about access to in-network providers. That was something that folks feel pretty comfortable with.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just let me bookend this portion of the budget. That's not a decision that needs to be made. It's not a decision that's being made this week, even by the council. But in terms of what we built into the budget, we had a stop the presses moment last Wednesday, and what we put in this budget is assuming that switch occurs. So the council will have more information to come on that. But overall, as pointed out, it's a decrease of approximately $175,000 for FY24 from the current year. Last thing I'll say about health insurance is every year at open enrollment, people get to choose different plan levels. And sometimes when there's vacant positions, for example, we'll make an assumption that someone has the most expensive family coverage. Sometimes that turns out not to be true, but that's how we budget, as if any of those vacancies were elected at family coverage. I'm gonna not dive into PERS on behalf. I'm happy to answer I'm happy to ask Melanie to answer any questions about PERS on behalf, but it's not a significant change in this budget from prior years. So there's some information in the letter there about PERS on behalf. The next section, though, is a significant change. What we've done for the first time is incorporate this concept of administrative services charges. These are charges to funds other than the general fund. So for example, the airport fund or the utility fund, as a way of compensating the general fund for services it provides to them. And an example of that might be human resources department or our IT department. They obviously spend time and resources serving the utility, the airport, but we as a municipality have not in the past applied essentially a fee for that service. It's really common. So a lot of municipalities do. And Melanie and I talked about it last year. We might have even talked about it 2 years ago. But as I mentioned, there were so many changes already happening with this budget by transitioning from annual to biennial that we didn't feel it was something we could tackle at the time. But this budget now does incorporate those administrative service charges as for the first time. And what we did was we looked at different methodologies, reached out to other municipalities, asked them how they were calculating these fees. And we landed on a fairly simple approach, which just looks at the number of employees in a department that's outside the general fund, compares that to the total number of employees. And then for certain departments, such as finance, city manager, IT, HR, we apply that percentage of the department's expenses to that other fund. For the utility as a whole, it comes in just over $217,000 would be what we calculated their administrative services fees for the year. That would be split over the three divisions: water, wastewater, and sewer. For the airport, it's approximately $30,800 that we've budgeted. So this shows up as new revenue for the general fund. It shows up as an expense in these other funds. And I think it's a more accurate and I would say fair way to reflect the actual true cost of those other departments. So for example, the utility department doesn't have an administrative assistant. The permits that are issued, people come here to City Hall, they're issued through the Public Works Department. Our front desk staff, we allocate a portion of their time to that department, but people coming to pay utility bills is a big portion of what they do out of the finance department. And in trying to allow those departments to be self-funded through their users, the specific properties that have water or sewer, or for the airport, those airport users, we felt that it was important to reflect some of the current services that aren't being billed to those departments and make those transfers. And I'll pause for questions on that.
And I certainly can see where on paper, having one person do all those things would be very helpful. Do you see personnel changes as a result of this? Do you see that the people using these funds will actually have individuals assigned to that department as compared to in central office? Do you see personnel changes, movement of people, or how does this reflect FTEs?
Great. Thank you for the question, Councilmember Carey. So I wouldn't see any change in terms of personnel, where they work, which department they're in as a result of this change. It does bring up an important point to point out that there are some employees who we already allocate a portion of their salary to these other funds. So for example, Kyle is our airport manager. And when we get to the airport department, you'll see we already allocate a portion of his salary to that fund. In terms of one of our finance department employees, they are significantly devoted to utility billing. So we allocate a portion of their time. What this is intended to capture is all the things we don't allocate: legal fees, HR, IT. So those other benefits that maybe it's not 25% of any one person's time, but yet there's a real true cost to the municipality for the work to do. This is intended to encapsulate all of those additional administrative fees. But in terms of where employees work, who they report to, this wouldn't impact that at all.
So efficiency wise, does it help you to have this data? I understand it's nice to know kind of where money's actually being spent for what, but is there efficiencies here? Is there?
Thank you. Good question. I think there's a tremendous amount of efficiency. So for example, if the airport were to have its own department for snow removal, you can see how there'd be a lot of times where they're very busy and a lot of times where they're not able to fill their work week. So snow example is a place where we have shared employees. They allocate some of their time from our streets and maintenance department. And that allows Scotty to work, in coordination with Kyle Cornelis, our airport manager, to just allocate those resources back and forth. Using the utility as an example, I think there's savings. If the utility did all of its own billing, if the utility had its own administrative staff person who was doing permitting and answering questions about where main lines are or where service lines exist, I think that would be a less efficient approach than what we're currently doing, which is just sharing some of our people among these different funds.
Ms. Hutchings.
I'm glad to see you doing that, because in the private sector, we do it all the time. We have a couple of accounting girls and they handle all departments. So you set up a percentage and it's expensed that way, and it's a really smart way and a clean way to do it. So I'm glad you're doing it.
I do have a question. Make sure I'm reading this right. The charges to the utility fund would be 217,000 and change.
Correct.
Was that taken into consideration when we did the rate change here just recently?
Great question, Mayor Whitney. It wasn't, but Melanie and I talked about it at the time as a concept. I wouldn't anticipate any additional changes to the rate structure because of this fee now being applied to that fund. So we are not proposing any different changes to that 5-year rate increase that was already approved by the council as a result of implementing this new transfer.
And Mr. Nelson, we haven't forgotten you. Do you have any questions that you want to have?
No, thank you, Mayor Whitney. I've been following along in my book and certainly appreciate the discussion. So I'll be sure and raise my hand if I do.
I'll check back up on you about every 20 minutes or so.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you. We'll continue next item in this letter. And again, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this letter. And then as you'll see, when we get to these pages in the book, we might move a little quickly. So thanks for your attention and following along. Next one, we cover personnel changes. And the first thing we do with every budget is remind the council of all the changes that were already approved in the current fiscal year we're in. So when we come to you, not as part of the budget process, but at some point during the year, if there are personnel changes, they will show up in the budget this time for the very first time. So it'll look like an increase in the budget, even though it's already been authorized by the council. And examples of those are we reclassified a regular part-time library clerk 1 to a regular full-time library clerk 2. That has occurred already. We reclassified some positions in the finance department. So we increased responsibilities and pay for our account clerk 4. That became our accountant in the finance department. And we also added a part-time HR assistant in the HR department. So those were both authorized as part of resolution 2022-036. In the clerk's department, we added a part-time records project assistant. That's Breck helping us out with some additional projects. So that had already occurred. And you will see those items in our staffing table for the first time with this budget, even though, as I mentioned, they've already been approved by the council. In terms of changes to what we are proposing as part of this budget, those first 3 listed on page Roman numeral 4 of the document are specific to what you were commenting on, Ms. Hutchings, where we're every year, Melanie looks at how we're allocating people's time and occasionally makes small adjustments based on what we think is the most accurate way to do that. So in terms of finance, public works, and maintenance, those aren't additional hours. Those aren't additional people. It's just a reallocation of their time among different departments. And we'll talk through those in detail when we go through those departments. The first addition to the staffing table is the library. We're proposing to add 351 more on-call hours. That's a bank of hours that Rachel uses as she schedules employees. So that is an addition to this budget, and it comes with an increase of approximately $7,567 for FY24. The new position we're proposing to add is 1 full-time laborer in the Parks and Rec department. So that would be a new person that we would go from having 2 full-time laborers to having 3. And I'll show you how that increase looks when we get to the staffing table as well. So the on-call hours at the library and the new Parks and Rec laborer, those are the only 2 additions in terms of staffing that impact our overall full-time equivalent status. But we did propose several changes within our existing structure. So there are 4 positions that I'm recommending be reclassified, increased from a range 19 to a range 20 as part of this budget. And that is the IT manager, HR manager, city librarian, and assistant to the city manager. These are department head positions or department level equivalent positions. And when I was reviewing data from our peer municipalities, these were 4 positions that to me struck out as being slightly below where we want them to be competitively in terms of what people can get in other places. So by reclassifying those positions from a range 19 to a 20, I think it makes them competitive. And that combined with reclassifying the public works director from a 23-24 is recommended in this budget. And again, that's due to looking at how other municipalities classify that position. It's common for that position to be one of the highest classified within municipality right next to, in our example, our finance director and our police chief. I'm supportive of that change, and this budget would include that change as a reclassification. So for those 5 positions combined, the budgetary impact would be an increase of $18,469 in FY '24. The other thing we did is, and I'll save additional comments, but I'm proposing to add 4 additional longevity steps to the salary schedule. We've got a lot of employees who have been with us for a very long time, or who hired on when they were in the middle or advanced portions of their career, who have topped out on the salary schedule. That means the city, in terms of wages, cannot provide any additional upward mobility and growth in their salaries. It's a concern from a retention standpoint, and by adding additional 2-year steps, we give people some additional time potentially to grow and stay with the city. So I'll show you that when we get to the salary schedule as well. I'm going to move maybe a little bit quickly through this section because we have overview documents that, oh, yep.
Please, just I want to let you know, the library needs a whole lot more people. I just want to let you know. Whatever you can find, wherever you can find it, there's needs to be more in the library.
And I do have one question. How many, other than the police department, how many current vacancies do we have within the city structure?
So Jessica, can you look that up and let me know, pass me a note and I'll give an answer? Yeah, right now we're doing a lot of hiring for our brand new seasonal employees, Parks and Rec. I think I signed 8 new hires on Friday, but we'll get that information and let you know. Thank you. I'm gonna thank you for allowing me to spend quite a bit of time on those. Those are some of the big impacts to the budget. I'm gonna move quickly now through some of these overviews. On page 5, Roman numeral 5 is where we have an overview of all funds. The total revenue for the city of Soldotna of all funds, so that's inclusive of utility and airport, et cetera, as well as the general fund, are projected to be just over 17 million in FY '24. And that's an increase of $2,326,332 over the current year. It's a 16% increase. So that's, as I mentioned, general fund, utility, et cetera. This is largely due to increases in sales tax revenue, projected interest earnings, and the addition of that administrative services charge. So that's something that shows up in our budget this first time as an additional expense. It's also an additional revenue showing up in the general fund. In terms of expenditures in the budget, we're projecting all funds at 17,797,000, which is an increase of about 18%, or 2,725,621 over the prior fiscal year. And that comes largely, the increase in expenses come from debt service. We've got debt service in our utility fund with the DEC loan for the project that wrapped up recently. And we've got new field house bond debt reimbursement. So that's showing up in the budget for the first time, as well as those other factors I already spent a lot of time talking about: inflation, which means higher salaries, higher cost of goods and services. But when we get to the pages in the budget showing you how all the revenues and expenditures live together within each fund, I think you'll have confidence that we're delivering a balanced budget, even giving significant growth in expenses, as well as the revenue side. So we break it down then by general fund. Next, we're looking at FY '24 revenue projections for the general fund of just over 13 million. That's an increase of $1,448,670, or about 12.5% over the current fiscal year. In terms of expenses, we're about the same percentage, a little bit more. Expenses are going to go up, we think, about 13.23% in the general fund in FY '24, bringing them to 13,815,357. So just kind of big, high level overview.
I do have one question. The Whistle Hill project, has that been included in the budget documents?
That is actually included in the capital project fund. So the expenditures are living in a capital project fund right now, and when The project is complete and we assess the individual property owners. Those revenues will come back into a fund similar to the street assessment fund, but it's for water and sewer. And since we currently don't have any of those, there's nothing in here right now. But it will be part of an operating budget for a similar type fund like the street assessment.
I'm going to save the specific discussions on the remaining funds for tomorrow because we're going to cover those in greater detail tomorrow. And if we can, ask you to flip ahead to Roman numeral 8, I believe it is. VIII. This is the one page in our budget that shows all expenditures by category, by account type. And so this will be expenditures across all budgetary funds, but this is a good place to go through if you're curious what payroll is across the city as a whole, or what travel and training or materials and supplies. So we've got a section of our budget document called Chart of Accounts, and it has definitions for each of these numbered accounts. But this page shows you expenditures per account type across all budget funds, and it compares. We give you 2 years of actual data. So FY21 and FY22, those are actual based on expenditures that were known to be true as part of our financial statements. FY23, the current fiscal year in, we're showing you what was approved as part of the budget. So we don't yet have actual numbers for FY23. We're still within FY23. So that is showing you the budget for FY23. And then for FY24 and 5, we compare those proposed budgets to the prior year. So you can look from budget year to budget year and see in any given category what the proposed increase or decrease or change was from the prior approved budget, or moving from years 1 to years 2 in the biennium.
A quick question on that page. A couple of things that kind of caught my eye real quick is fuel costs overall quoted as going down, but yet you go to the gas station and we're seeing the the fuel prices going up. So I'm not quite sure if we got some kind of a cut deal with someplace or what.
That's because in the mid-biennium update that when we came back to you, we had budgeted, I believe it was unleaded at $5 a gallon based on projected usage, and also diesel at $5 a gallon. And we're seeing that that's not the case. It was going up and it has come down some. And so in this current budget, we budgeted unleaded at $4 a gallon, I believe, and diesel at $4.50 a gallon. That's something that I have gone over with our maintenance manager. He pays pretty close attention to what gas prices are doing, and just tracking them over the years, that we felt like this was a good amount.
And looking at the individual budgets, I think the only one that didn't show an increase, didn't show a decrease, was Public Works. And that's probably the ones that use the most amount of gas or fuel.
So impacting these budgets are what we project it to be, the gallons used to be, also the cost per gallon. And it's possible that when we were budgeting last year, what we projected to be at the end of the year and what we based our budget at the mid-biennium update, maybe that was off a little bit. So it might not necessarily be that the costs are going down. It just might be that it's gone down from what the prior budget was, what we anticipated the prior budget to be.
And I noticed the same in natural gas, which I would imagine is N-Star. And there again, I'm looking at my homeowners, and I keep my place pretty cool.
Right, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the cost is going down, the cost is going up, but it could be that we budgeted a little too high in the prior year and we're bringing that down to where we think it's going to be. We have definitely factored in increases. It's just compared to what we project the usage to be based on the last several years.
Yeah. Moving on.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to the next page. That prior page we just discussed was only expenditures. This is the first summary page in the budget that shows you revenues and expenditures and the projected impact on the individual funds. This page, Roman numeral 9, is the FY24 projections of all funds. And you can see there In the general fund, these are some of the numbers that I referenced directly from that summary letter, but we've got the total operating revenues, we've got the total operating expenses. They then show whether there's a surplus or deficit in that fund. But as we've talked about in years past, we historically know that the city doesn't expend all of the funds that are budgeted typically in any given year. We call that a lapse. So in the general fund, we project a 5% lapse of expenses, meaning that in any given year across the entire fund, we will have leftover money in contracted services or materials, not this year materials and supplies, but some other budget categories, typically about 5%. We build that into the budget document because we feel that it's the most realistic way to show our expectations. And with that lapse, you see that the general fund is projected to be a small deficit, $85,000. I think that's about as balanced as Melanie and I have delivered you a budget in the last 5 years. So I think that's a really strong position for us, given the additional increases we talked about and increases that are yet to come from things like the second tranche of the Fieldhouse funding or general fund expenditures in that regard. But it shows, in my opinion, a balanced general fund. The utility fund, we're anticipating an increase of $210,000. That's consistent with recent years. And again, that's before the new debt we will be taking on soon that was recently authorized by the council for the dewatering project. That'll be a new loan through the state of Alaska. We haven't included that yet in this budget because we don't yet have those terms. But there'll be some additional expenses. And so I think that's a consistent good position for the utility fund to be in. Unfortunately for Kyle and the airport fund, it shows in the red for the first time in a few years. And that's due to now those administrative services charges being applied to the airport fund. So the airport is still doing very well and we're very proud of it, but on paper, it's going to show a small deficit this year. And tomorrow, maybe we can talk a little bit more about opportunities, but there remain tremendous opportunities for growth and revenue growth, specifically at our airport. And Kyle's going to be working on those projects in years to come. The following page is the same information, but includes data from FY25, so the second year of the budget book. But same, giving you a revenue, expense, and a projected change in fund balance for each of the city's funds. Moving forward in the budget document, I mentioned the next section is that chart of accounts. That's the definitions of the different account titles we use throughout the budget document. So if you're ever curious what goes where, and we as employees refer to this too. Melanie will say, nope, chairs go in this category and you put it in this other category. This is how we stay consistent among the different departments about where we're billing things, and those, a lot of information there. There's a couple new accounts, like on page XIII, Vice Mayor Parker, what Roman numeral is that? XIII 13? Okay, thank you. For example, 45025, a city lobbyist. In years where we didn't have that expense, there would not have been this entry in this chart of accounts. And you can see 46000, administrative service charges. That's the first time that's new to this budget document this year. That's where you can get information about all of those account codes we use. Moving forward, I've got just a little bit more information to get through, and then I'll ask Mayor if anyone wants to take a quick break before we dive into the departments, but just a couple more things to cover. The authorized personnel staffing table appears in our budget, page 15, Roman numeral 15. This is where you look at the different departments, how many employees are authorized in each department, what those positions are, and what range they're at. And we give you three columns of data. We tell you the current year and proposed FY24, proposed FY25. So this document will include the reclassifications that I mentioned earlier. So those 4 department head level positions that I'm proposing to reclass from a 19 to a 20, you'll see that listed on this document. You'll also see, if you flip to the next page, some additional hours built in for the short-term on-call clerk at the library. So for example, that's a range 4 position. And in FY23, we budget at 0.60 of a FTE for that. Those additional 351 hours will show up in FY24 and FY25 as that position being budgeted at 0.77 FTE. So that's one of the 2 increases in staff time we've added to the budget. The next one proposed is in Parks and Rec, kind of in the middle of that Parks and Rec category. There's a Parks and Recreation laborer, which is a range 5. If you look in FY '23, you'll see we have 2 of those positions, but we're requesting that it be increased to 3 for the upcoming 2 fiscal years. I'll just note one interesting, for some context, Melanie and I did a 10-year look back on staffing and wanted to look at how staffing had changed. I can tell you that in the Parks Department, in the past 10 years, we have only added 0.58 of 1 person over the past 10 years. This budget would bring us to 1.8, essentially 1.5 extra people over where we were 10 years ago. I think that demonstrates a tremendous amount of resourcefulness and I hope shows you the skill in managing a department that is doing so much more with essentially the same. So in that time, we've added the Memorial Park, the flower baskets and all the beautification downtown, Soldotna Creek Park and all the events, and yet had held staffing really consistently almost the same over that 10-year period. So I think the additional labor is prudent at this point. It's going to be important and will support the operations of that department. And I just say this as a kind of maybe a precursor to a budget 2 years from now when the field house comes online. That's going to be another important opportunity to look at our staffing resources and whether they're keeping track with all the good programs and services we provide.
Just out of curiosity, 10 years ago, how many full-time employees did we have? Full-time equivalents?
So across all departments, we were about 70, and now we're proposing to be about 77. So 7 new employees. 2.5 of those were in the library. So originally yes, thank you, Councilmember Carey. Originally, we expanded that significant expansion of the library. And at that point, originally, there wasn't a significant adjustment. Since then, as we've grown programming and really demand the users at the library, we've added a couple more positions. So the library's seen some increase. The other increases are, I think, kind of part-time position here, kind of sprinkled throughout the different departments. So about 7 employees over the last 10 years.
So less than 1 a year. Yeah. Okay, moving on.
The next page in the budget book is the salary schedule for non-represented employees. And Melanie, we'll probably get some, does it say that? Oh, we'll get a new title on this page when we reprint this budget book. But this first salary schedules for non-represented employees, you'll see the positions listed at the different ranges. This incorporates the 4.5 increase already for cost of living adjustment. And it includes 4 additional longevity steps. So as I mentioned, one of my concerns with retention was not giving employees a high enough upper bar to top off out on their range. This budget would propose the addition of steps M through P. So 4 additional 2-year 2% steps. That's going to be immediately helpful for some people we already have who have already reached the end of the range and who we don't want to lose to other employers or other opportunities. So adding the steps doesn't have an immediate additional cost to the city. It will in future years if those people stay, which is what we would hope to achieve with that change. If you flip the page, the next salary schedule is, we'll get a title put on that. Sorry about that, apologize. But that'll be the PSEA salary schedule for those employees in the police department who are represented by that collective bargaining agreement. It also has a 4.5% increase to COLA built in. I will say this salary schedule already included M through P. So 4 years ago, when we were renegotiating their collective bargaining agreement, we spent a lot of time focusing on retention. And at that point, we identified this strategy as being important to keeping some of our public safety officers with us long-term. So that is not a change. This was already in this budget. Again, what we're doing with the non-represented salary schedule is saying, here's a tool that we think is effective, and we are going to apply it to that one as well, proposing to apply it. Last thing I'll mention on this salary schedule, the police clerk 2 and the police officers are represented under that collective bargaining agreement. The sergeants are not, but traditionally and historically, we have included them on this salary schedule. They get traditionally the same wage increases as the officers. That's important to avoid what we call wage compression, where if we were not advancing the sergeants at the same rate as the officers, we would then have officers potentially approaching that higher level position and maybe even overtaking it. So just point that out as additional context. They're on the salary schedule. That's consistent with how we've done it in the past, even though they're not members of that bargaining agreement. So that concludes our big picture summary, and it's about an hour and 15. We're next going to start moving through the general fund departments, and I'm happy to keep going, or if folks want a quick break, we could take a quick break, Mayor.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take 5 minutes.
Thank you.
It's been 5 minutes. We'll go back to this. Nope, our recorder's not here. Okay. We're going back on.
Invitation from the Kenai Peninsula College.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Whitney. We'll get started on page 1 of the budget book. And this will now be our recap of the general fund, and then we'll go into each general fund department. And for this portion, I'm going to kick it over to Finance Director Imholt to take you through the general fund.
So on page 1 is the recap of the general fund. It's going to show the revenues versus the expenditures and the net effect, change in fund balance. I don't think we'll probably spend any time there, but if you want to flip to the next page, page 2, it shows the revenues. We've gone through the big changes in revenues, sales tax, property taxes, you know, the revenues that have more of an impact on the budget previously. So the other thing that I would note on this general, the revenue page is KPHA, ICE KPHA was a big increase, and leagues was a big increase. And the reason for that is because we're putting ICE in at the Sports Center 2 months early. So that is a significant increase to the revenue budget, but then it's going to be offset by a significant increase to the expenditure budget for electricity in the Sports Center. Other than that, I don't.
Didn't mean to interrupt you.
Sure.
Is there anything currently going through the legislative process that would affect this? The revenue sources that again, they're talking about now again, that aren't here.
Thank you, Councilmember Carey. Not that I'm aware of. So revenue sharing, community assistance through the state is built into this budget, but that's fairly routine. Bigger questions related to if a state sales tax were to gain traction, we would anticipate potential impact from that, but we don't have an analysis on that or haven't performed that analysis at this time.
So I don't think there's much else to talk about on the revenues. We hit the high level things in the letter when Stephanie was going through those. Moving on to page 3, that's just a summary of expenditures by department. And then on page 4 would be expenditures by line item, similar to the one that we did previously for all departments. This would be specific to the general fund. And if there's no questions on those, we'll just dig into the individual budgets, starting with the mayor and council.
Mr. Carey?
So on page 3, and
Okay.
23, the 791 down to 60. I don't mind. What are you guys not doing?
So that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to those budgets, but that is because we split the finance department and the HR department. They used to be all in one, now they're separate. So you're gonna see a decrease for the finance department and an increase for the HR department. Okay, and they're not quite offset because we've implemented a few new things in the HR department that we'll talk about when we get there. Okay. So moving on to page 6, mayor and council, or actually page 7. Mayor and council, there's not a lot to report on in this department. Unfortunately, Johnny's not here, so if there's any follow-up questions, we can get back to you with the answers to those. But the biggest change in this department is she is looking at implementing a new meeting management software. And by doing so, it would increase the support and maintenance contract by $11,100 in the first year. And it would reduce the advertising and promotion budget by about $7,200. And the reason for that is because we had audio video streaming that was included in the advertising and promotion budget that's now going to be taken care of with this new meeting management software.
I had sent an email asking with the fact that the Clarion is not publishing anymore. Is that going to change our advertising it in any way, shape or form we gonna have to go to an alternate source or just how's that gonna happen?
Thank you. And I did see that email. I think it's something that our city clerk Blankenship will come back to the council and engage in a conversation about. Potentially whether there's a change in code or policy that you want to make as a result of that. And what the alternatives might be. So I would anticipate a change just to our rates currently, as well as the availability of days. I think this Saturday is the last paper they're printing at that printing location. So I would suggest if it's okay, if it's acceptable, to be continued and allow Clerk Blankenship to share some feedback on that topic.
Okay.
So Mayor Whitney at a recent meeting said he wanted to at Progress Days. Oh, there's the Progress Days event, 4,000 for this year. So, and I would suspect on the advertising, even though the Clarion is not doing printing, because it's online where you have to access online, you can still look at things online. And the rate will stay the same.
Yeah, I believe that Johnny is working on something even before it came out that the Clarion was going to be moving to 2 days. I think she has a plan that she's wanting to bring forward, but that would be separate from this, and included in this budget is if we're doing things the same way we always have.
I'll just jump in and add, since this is the first department, we implemented this, I think at the prior budget, but that box at the bottom of each department has notes, and those notes are specific to any significant increase or decrease. That's a great historical footnote to look back, and it'll tell you for example, that we've reduced our National League of Cities to more accurately reflect cost. Melanie's really good at capturing the specifics of any significant changes, and those notes are where you can find that in any department budget.
And speaking of the National League of Cities, the reason it has gone down is when we implemented that a few years ago, the quote that we had gotten was different than if we went through AML. And we've noticed that if you go through AML, the cost is cheaper. It's passed on by AML, and so we've reduced it to accurately reflect what we're paying. Moving on to the city manager budget on page 10. We increased travel and training for increased professional development for the assistant to the city manager. Previously, there hadn't been anything budgeted for that position. And then we also reallocated some budgets between advertising and promotion and contracted services based on what we anticipate the needs to be. Other than that, there's not much more to report. The finance department, moving on, page 13. Not a lot of. Sure.
Just as a reminder, ask Melanie to maybe take a step back to page 11 and show you an example of where we give the salary allocation, the cost breakdown of positions that end up sharing duties with other funds.
So if you look at the pages we previously showed you for the personnel staffing table, it will show the finance department as having 4 employees. But on this page here, on page 11, it shows 3.5 employees because we have 0.25 of the account clerk 3 position that's allocated 12.5% to sewer and 13% or 12.5% to water and 12.5% to sewer. And same with the admin assistant position. So it's only 0.75% in the finance department for each of those positions. And we have this throughout the whole budget document. So our maintenance department, where they're allocated between the street department and the airport fund, you'll see the allocation. Or like Kyle, for example, who's allocated public works and airport, you'll see that on here as well in their narratives for their departments. On page 13, not a lot of changes in finance other than the big one of separating out the finance department and HR. The only change related to the finance piece of this was that we added a CASEL conference attendance for one of our account clerks. Previously, we alternated between the 2 positions. One would go 1 year, the other one would go the next year. This is proposing that we send both people each year. We also increased the auditing contracts based on CPI, and that's spelled out in the contract itself. And the other changes are just related to separating the 2 departments, HR and finance.
So what is that conference?
Where is the conference?
No, what
Is it? It's our accounting software that we use called CASEL. And they hold an annual conference each year that I think is very beneficial to go to. especially since we have newer people in those positions. It would be a great thing for them to be able to do. Moving on to the IT department. On page 16 and 17. In the prior year, we had included some training for the IT technician, and that was taken out in this year because he completed that training. And so that was a decrease, but it was offset by an increase to professional development for the IT technician. That was the change there. The other big changes are related to small tools, and that computers, network devices, tablets, servers, security cameras, all of those replacements are based on replacement schedules. And so those can go up and down greatly each year, depending on where we're at in the replacement schedule. There's some changes there. And the other changes are just small, related to individual support maintenance contracts.
I'll just add that in addition to Melanie and myself, we're joined by all of the department heads. So I want to thank them for all the work that goes into the budget. They share responsibility. Actually, they own most of the responsibility throughout the year to effectively administer the budget and the funds prudently. And so if you have any questions for them, Bryce Cunningham's our IT manager. He's with us here. If there are any questions that you want to direct at Bryce or any of the others as we go through, please call them up and we'll get them in front of the microphone and get your questions answered.
Go ahead.
Did you have any comments? That requested additional employees?
So all of the personnel requests were, somebody tell me if I misspeak. They were all included in the budget. So there were no requests for employees other than the ones that were passed forward by Melanie and myself as part of the recommended budget.
So moving on to the city clerk, page 20. Not a lot of changes here.
Can I make a general comment on IT? I have to say, a year ago, we were getting, it seems like inundated with junk mail from folks, and that has pretty much gone. So thank you for the job you guys have done.
And thank you, all of you, the royal you, for not clicking any specific suspicious link in an email or opening an attachment. If you're ever in doubt, Bryce will vet it for you. Okay, page 20, only increase here really is related to elections and increasing for election supply replenishments. Small changes in travel and training just based on where conferences are and the cost of attending the conferences. I think that's pretty much it for the city clerk. Moving on to HR. As mentioned before, this was, there was a decrease in finance and we moved those over to the HR department. In addition to the things that were moved over, there were a few changes to the HR department. We increased some subscriptions, that was minor. We did increase advertising and promotion slightly based on anticipated recruitment for the upcoming year. The bigger changes come into the contracted services account 43300. And that's related to background checks. We've increased the amount we spend on those based on anticipated recruitment and the cost that we're spending on some of the background checks we're having to do based on the positions. We also added some funding for healthcare consulting and broker services. And the broker services, I don't know if you want to speak to that or. Sure. Yeah, so the work that we did with recently the healthcare consultants, we paid for as a standalone contract. We had a specific need we asked them to assist us with, and they provided us a quote, and we just engaged with them that way. There are communities that retain healthcare brokers indefinitely from year to year. And they then handle a lot of the negotiations. They're tracking the data, they're reporting back. And given that this is a really to me, complicated, changing landscape. I see, we reached out to one of the municipalities that retains brokers on an ongoing basis, and they really felt there was tremendous value in doing that. So this budget includes a new expense, that healthcare consulting brokerage services. That's a $50,000 expense annually. If we were to retain services, we would go out competitively as we would solicit quotes, and the council would have the approval of any award of that contract. But that's something that we have not had in the past that we feel there may be benefit to having moving forward.
The other items in the contracted services are wage and benefit consulting. That's, we budgeted an ongoing expense just to basically make sure that we're staying competitive with other agencies, and anytime we need services from a consultant, we have the ability to go out and solicit their help. We've also included citywide leadership training on an ongoing basis, something that we did this year for the first time and felt it very beneficial. Wanted to put something in the budget to do that annually. And then the last thing I'll note is employee appreciation under the miscellaneous account. That's something that previously was in the non-departmental account, and we moved it over into the human resources account. That's not an increase in total expenditures, it's just where it's being located. And the reason that we moved it over is because we felt like it was one of the things that we would want to allocate to the admin, under the admin fees to the utility department and the airport department. And since we're allocating human resources department, it would get included in that allocation then.
What is Neo Government?
That is a program that we use for onboarding and advertising.
Currently, all of our open positions are advertised through NeoGov. It's the website, it's the
Okay.
platform that we use for people to see job postings and then apply directly through that system. And we implemented that this last year was the first time. I think it's a significant improvement. Before, we were living in a different decade using maybe PDF documents. This is definitely modernizing that recruitment portion, hiring portion.
And that is not new to this budget. That was. Okay, moving on to the police department. Okay, so we did increase travel and training for greater emphasis on professional development. Under materials and supplies, there's a couple of new items. One of the things is gym equipment repair materials. That's because some of our gym equipment is aging and needing some things replaced. I know that the chief is looking at some grants through Alaska Police Standards Council to replace some of the equipment, but this is to repair some of the pieces of equipment that are currently there. He's also included community engagement supplies. That's going to be an ongoing expense and new to this budget. And then also worth noting is that in FY24, we did eliminate the DARE program supplies because they don't anticipate having a DARE officer in FY24 just due to some staffing changes. So that expense and the position will come back in FY25, but it is not there for FY24.
Just for a funding source, the Elks do fund their program. So there's a funding source if you're looking for some.
Let's see. We did increase uniforms slightly to, because of hiring new officers, new positions. In small tools, workstation replacements, that's a non-recurring expense, but it's something that, in FY24, they're going to be replacing the officer desks. And then in FY25, they're going to replace staff desks. So that is an increase to those budgets. Also in small tools is shotgun rifle optic and lighting replacements. That's also a non-recurring charge that's happening in FY24. And the police chief is here and can answer any questions related to those if need be. The janitorial did go up slightly. We're budgeting an increase and it's a complete shot in the dark because we're going out to bid in FY24 and we don't know what janitorial services are going to be. So that's in the police department, non-departmental department, street department, and library. So we will see an increase in those budgets. I mean, I think right now our fees are quite low, and we anticipate when we go out to bid, they're probably going to raise. So
I've-
it was a guess.
I've seen this in the other departments, but Forgot to ask.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's because we're going up this.
Sanitation,
Oh, sanitation,
what is it?
dumpster rental, outhouses. Like the big dumpster outs, get garbage pickup. is
Okay.
Sanitation, outhouses at the parks. and the
What
campgrounds,
about in the police department?
Dumpster rental?
The
big-
dumpsters?
The
Okay.
dumpsters
All
and the hauling away of the trash from the dumpsters, yes. And then also in the Parks and Rec department, it's gonna be pumping of from the outhouses. Okay, so moving on to dues and subscriptions, we added a Police One Academy, which is an online law enforcement training platform. There were some CPI increases to a couple of the contracts, the animal shelter contract and the dispatch services contract, and that's based on what CPI is, that 8.1%, and that was built into the contracts.
And I'll add, so the animal control shelter agreement with the city of Kenai is due to be renewed. It expires this June, next month, in the coming months. And so Chief is kind of doing coordination meetings with Kenai, and we'll bring back a resolution to the council to consider extending that agreement. The dispatch services contract, it's got a few more years, a couple more years, and you've all heard me say quite a bit about that. But hopefully that's an area where we can continue to communicate and re-engage with the borough at some point. Those costs escalate and there might be opportunities to work with the administration and revisit that. So I'd be hopeful that we'll continue to do that.
Can I ask question? Since there's new administration at both the city of Kenai and coming into the city of Soldotna, is there still support from the city of Kenai for doing the animal shelter contract with the city of Soldotna?
Thank you, Vice Mayor Parker. I believe there is, and in fact, I believe their contract can be extended administratively. So their city manager may have the authority to authorize that extension. Our process would require it to come back to the council, but I anticipate there's still support. And at this point, the meetings are just working out to see if any small details or minor tweaks are appropriate. And they're going to meet this Thursday, our team and their team, to discuss.
A follow-up related to the dispatch services contract. Do you get a report, a spreadsheet from the borough that shows the actual time spent on 911 so that we can justify these numbers?
Like Mayor Parker, that's one of the things that we're looking into right now. I've been named the lead for the 911 Advisory Board. And that question has come up because right now we have several other towns and cities in the jurisdiction that are trying to account for where the money comes from and where it goes to. So we're currently working through obtaining those numbers. We've been receiving a little bit of pushback from the actual cell phone companies as far as where we're getting the money from, but we're working through that issue.
And something that we talked about in the context of operating budget, but we decided it's a more appropriate conversation to happen during the capital budget discussion, relates to the technology improvements and updates we're wanting to see in the body worn and in the cars. Those type of technological improvements are also going to cause us to want to revisit this conversation because, for example, our officers within their own patrol units will have the ability to access information and input information into the system that doesn't require it to go through dispatch as a call for service. So currently they're tracking those numbers. Moving forward, our operations may change in a way that significantly causes that to change even based on what they were showing this current year and last year. So I think good opportunities to re-engage on that topic. Any other questions for Chief Meek on the police department budget? A lot of recruitment expenses.
I can make that happen.
Thanks, Chief.
And moving on to the Public Works Administration Department. Increased materials and supplies slightly due to building code updates and needing to get code books and publications related to that. There's also an increase for professional development and legislative session travel to Juneau, so travel and training did go up slightly. And then the only other change was contracted services. We increased that to allow for additional pre-project services. And that
Pre-project services means getting some additional support as we've got projects coming to get as much information as we can about budget, about scope. As you've seen with some of our projects, the landscape of estimating project costs got pretty strange during COVID. And as inflation increases and costs go up, there's value, we think, in budgeting for additional support within our Public Works Department to get that professional services when they need them, so that we have more information, hopefully better information about projects before we even bring them to the council for consideration for funding or approval. So I think that's going to be an improvement on our process based on the challenges we've been seeing in pinning down project scope, schedule, budget questions.
Moving on to the shop departments. This is where we start seeing some of the changes in materials and supplies, small tools, the inflationary increases that we talked about before. So materials and supplies is going up for the inflationary impact. Small tools is going up for that same reason. And then also we are proposing to replace a vehicle diagnostic system and a tire pressure monitoring system that are aged and not working very well. Contracted services is also going up, and that's due to inflationary increases that are being passed on to us by contractors.
It's also good to point out, as we transition from more of the administrative departments into these other departments, you're going to see more variability from year to year in things like small tools, materials and supplies, because they'll be related to a specific project or a specific equipment that's getting cycled out. Whereas kind of within here at City Hall, we see much less variability from year to year. Our expenses are much more consistent and predictable. And so whether it's utility or the shop, streets department, that's to be expected. That's pretty normal. And in all of those cases, we'll have a note on the bottom telling you why it's different from prior years.
Question on the shop. Does the shop take care of the police department vehicles?
The shop takes care of all the vehicles.
Okay,
And
and
all of the equipment.
so is there an administrative fee for, well, I guess there wouldn't be.
So, there is in the utility department or the utility fund and the airport fund, there's something called, I think it's called shop charges, and that is a fee that we charge those different funds for the use of the shop. It's the mechanics hours, it's the materials and supplies that go into repairing or maintaining the vehicles. And that's something that's passed on to those other funds. It's not something that we have spread to the general fund, just strictly funds outside of it.
And Melanie, are we doing that on a direct expense basis? So they're tracking real expenses and tracking real time spent. And then that's what gets billed to those other funds.
Pretty much it for the shop departments. Moving on to the street department, page 36. We had a big increase to materials and supplies. Again, inflationary increases, and mainly that's the calcium fluoride. If you have any specific questions related to that, Scotty's here and can probably answer that. But we've had a few items. You'll see it in the utility department as well, where the cost of that material has skyrocketed, and this is one of them. We mentioned janitorial going out to bid. That's going to affect this department as well. Rental increased some due to planned projects for FY 24 and 25. And contracted services decreased because we eliminated something that was included in the prior year as a one-time deal, like a non-recurring charge. Other than that, there's minor increases to the street department. Building repair and maintenance. Not a lot here other than to contracted services. And again, this is inflationary increases that are being passed on by contractors.
good point to point out, that we now had a really heavy snow year under our belt. We had made a couple changes that the council approved. One of them was increasing our contracted services for snow removal. And that was a contract that allowed us to call people in more frequently here at City Hall. But where we really saw the benefit, I think Scotty would say, is over at the sports center. So instead of our crew on a heavy snow day, prepping for a Brown Bears hockey game or a high school hockey game, we were able to, in a couple instances, call on that contractor to go clear that snow. And so that was, I think, very helpful in supporting our goals of maintaining higher quality of snow removal throughout town. We could lean on them when we needed to. And this year was an extreme year, as you know, that came in really handy. So I think that that's a smart expenditure. And in terms of snow removal in general, we did come back to the council for supplemental funding this year. We are not requesting that funding every year moving forward. So we're going to budget as we would have in a normal snow year, because most of the time we think that that's going to be sufficient. And if we're ever in a very heavy snow year like we were this year, we would come back to the council in that case.
The other change in this department, and you'll notice that equipment replacement payment went down, and that payment is what the various departments pay to the equipment replacement fund, the equipment replacement fund is the fund that purchases the vehicles and heavy equipment that we use, and then we bill the individual departments based on over the useful life of those pieces of equipment. And this is the first year in the building repair and maintenance department where they haven't had it because that piece of equipment is now paid off. There was a reduction there. Most departments, you're going to see, some variation as we add vehicles on and take vehicles get paid off. There's a lot of change from year to year. Moving on to economic development and planning. It's pretty straightforward. Small increase in travel and training related to the planner attending some AICP exam training. And then advertising and promotion, we decreased it slightly to reflect anticipated usage, but again, as changes get made that Johnny may be bringing forward, that could affect this account as well. No questions, we'll move on to the next department, which is the library. Favorite department, the fun department. Let's see, office supplies increased to purchase library cards and for inflationary increases of supplies. The big one here is under telephone and internet, and this is something that Rachel will probably want to speak to, but there's an additional item under telephone and internet, and it's the mobile data for patron hotspot program. That's a program that is now being offered that was previously funded by some grants and then also by the Friends of the Library. And so if we want to continue offering this to patrons, this is something that we would need to pay for. I don't know if Rachel, if you want to describe what that is, if you want to. Yeah, here, I can even pass it to you.
Yes, so I briefly talked about it when we came with the Friends donation to support it. This was originally an ARPA funded program, and it's just what it sounds like. We have mobile devices called hotspots that provide mobile data for people that maybe they don't have internet at home or they don't have fast internet at home or wherever they need to do business or school or whatever they need to do. We have 12 hotspots right now. They cost $53 a month to provide the data. And so this is what that is. So it's $53 per month for 12 devices for next year. I looked at our information and we've circulated them 225 times since it's been about a year, a little over a year since we started circulating them. It's a very popular program. And we have been discussing, how long can we continue doing this? I did run the numbers again today and I've got the wrong one. I actually had to get updated numbers. It's like a $152 savings for every patron that borrows a hotspot. That's the estimate of how much they're saving by borrowing that hotspot and using it. And I have all the data. If you ever want to see the table, it's based on AT&T's numbers for what they would be charging an individual. And so there's overage rates and things like that I don't need to get into right now, but you have any other questions, feel free to ask. Yes, Mr. Carey.
Janitorial up 7,000. Are we planning better, more?
That's because we're going out to bid.
So that's an estimate because we're going to go out to bid. We'll be soliciting new quotes and we anticipate that costs may be going up of that service. We use an outside contract to clean at the library.
How about postage? I just noticed that's a
Oh.
significantly larger increase.
Oh, yeah.
We're gonna be mailing more stuff out.
So this is to reflect increased postage costs for interlibrary transit. So I think the amount that
Excellent.
you're transmitting is more. There's more books being shipped from different libraries and we pay the postage on that. Is that correct?
Okay, and obviously we're planning for the additions on the library and the additional libraries in the town is somewhere reflected here. And so, well, like the internet, it's kind of like, those are movable libraries, again, cyber libraries. And so again, I'm looking forward to the plans for the additional libraries in the town. Thank you.
It is probably worth noting that under support and maintenance contracts, some of them went up but we've also, that's somewhat offsetting that increase is that we eliminated the self-checkout and curbside application because it wasn't being utilized very well.
And I'll just clarify, we eliminated the MeScan, which is a app-based device. We still have self-checkout at the kiosk at the library. But for a while during the pandemic, we had tried this other software and it just never seemed to really get as much usage. So we still have the lockers, the hold lockers out front and the self-checkout, and that's really efficient, fabulous way to check yourself out. But yeah, thanks, Melanie.
Okay, moving on to the sports center. Materials and supplies, there's a couple of, or 3 different things that are being proposed under materials and supplies that are, see, the Freon, that's replenishment. We had kind of a stockpile and we've used all of it up. I believe that there is an analysis that the sports center is going to be bringing forward to look at Freon, and I don't know if Joel or Andrew want to kind of talk about that, but it could eliminate this probably in the future.
As y'all probably know, Freon's on its way out. It's been on its way out. Current rates are about $100 a pound, or up to $100 a pound. So, but just overall, as far as the industry goes, there will be a consulting contract coming forth to go out to bid to get some expert consultation on the direction that the city should review going forward towards when that actually the Freon system-based refrigerant system can be replaced, or if there are replacement for refrigeration systems or refrigerants out there. Refrigeration's an odd science, so there's all kinds of snake oil at times and other stuff, so different things. So there will be a project coming forward, have a consultant point the city. Won't be a cheap fix, or it could be very cheap. We don't know.
Looking at the electricity, it's a substantial increase there. Is there something that we missed? It went up $57,000, which is what almost a 30% increase.
Right, part of that is just anticipated rate increases, but then the other part of it is to offset the revenue that we previously mentioned related to the ice going in 2 months early.
So we're going to be putting the ice in early August, which is quite a bit earlier than we normally would. So we're going to have a lot more utility, especially electricity expenses this year than we would in a normal year. It's more expensive to keep that ice in the warm months than it is in the winter months. So adding the ice in to accommodate the scheduling of the leagues that want to get in a little bit earlier comes with an expense, which is why we want to make sure, and I think we were successful in working with the different user groups to ensure that they're going to be reserving and securing enough of that ice time to help pay that additional expense.
Are we going to have a rate increase to reflect some of this?
We aren't proposing a rate increase at this time, but it's prudent to reevaluate those rates periodically. That's not hadn't been part of this process, so we weren't proposing that at this time.
So, under materials and supplies, the other couple items worth noting is rink glass replacement, the non-recurring charge. That would need to be done in FY '24, and then the rink kick plate replacement in FY '25. So those are some changes to the materials and supplies. Then there are a number of other items in there that we've increased, just because of inflationary increases that we're seeing for those various supplies.
I know we've got a ordinance, I believe it's coming up, a resolution, can't remember which, to go with the electric exam. Is that going to change anything on the propane? Or is there a
When that-
long
when
lead
that's
time on
finalized.
that?
Within the at least 24 budget, the Zambonis are a year out. So that there would be no change the first year, and then the other one, with that, there would be an amount, probably a significant amount.
So we will present kind of a comparison to the council as part of the equipment replacement fund budget tomorrow when we get to that point. We are requesting a new Zamboni, and we have budgeted for an electric Zamboni, but it's more expensive than the traditional model, and Scotty's got all that information, and Andrew or Joel, if they're here, we can talk through the pros and cons tomorrow.
Moving down to uniforms, that's being increased due to additional staff. Small tools and minor equipment. Increase there is related to replacement floor scrubber and floor sweeper and HDMI wireless system replacements. And then more inflationary increases that we're seeing across the board. We did increase vending supplies because the sales volume has gone up, as well as more inflationary increases. Electricity, as you noted, went up because we're putting ice in 2 months earlier. And again, the hockey revenues for those two, it's KPHA, and then it's the youth programs, I believe, are the only ones. Okay. The youth programs, there's two different line items in the revenue budget that were increased to offset the increase in electricity.
Mr. Nelson, I forgot to ask, got anything you'd like to add or questions?
No, thank you, Mayor. I'm still following along and can hear everybody. Thank you.
In contracted services, we did add an item in there for ongoing refrigeration services because we recognized as some struggles that we had this season that it would probably be a good idea to have some funding there for ongoing refrigeration services. I think that's pretty much the big highlights of the sports center. Moving on to the campgrounds. And materials and supplies, proposing replacing the remaining picnic tables that are the older wooden picnic tables, and half of those being done in FY '24 and half in FY '25. Gravel for top dressing trails in FY '25, and the other increases are inflationary increases. Uniforms again went up due to additional staff, small tools related to inflationary increases. Vending supplies, again, larger resale or larger sales volume, that's for ice at the campgrounds. Contracted services are going up. We're proposing increasing the camp host stipends from $400 a month to $500 a month. That's pretty much.
Melanie, can you, we kind of moved past it in the revenue side, but are we anticipating a status quo year at the campgrounds in terms of visitation, or how did we consider that?
So revenues for campgrounds, we predicted, we looked at what we thought we were going to bring in this year based on what we've already brought in and the small amount that we'll bring in at the end of the fiscal year. And we based it, I think we increased it just slightly for the next fiscal year. But this year was a bigger year than prior years. So it was a little bit of an increase, yes. Our campgrounds are doing good.
So a couple of years ago, we had issues finding campground hosts during COVID. Is that back to normal operations there now?
During COVID, we had people ready to come. They just couldn't get through Canada. So we've got a solid core of them that come. We've got two couples that work in Centennial. A gentleman works in Swiftwater the whole summer, and then we have another individual just comes for about a month and a half and helps out during the peak season. So far, we've been pretty lucky on that.
Moving on to Parks and Recreation. We did increase materials and supplies for the inflationary factor, but then also just because of expanded green space throughout the city. There's a couple of non-recurring items in here. One of them is for the large tent that we have at the parks, replacing the top. Evidently, you can replace just the top.
And yeah, sorry, that was the ConocoPhillips tent that was donated to the city. And so we'll have the ability to get a brand new cover for it. We don't lease that out, loan that out, but we use it to support a lot of our own events or partner events at the park. So
No longer waterproof.
we're still putting it to good use.
Also, gravel for top dressing trails is included in the materials and supplies accounts. Uniforms went up so that we could add 4 sets of cold weather gear to be used by part-time staff, and also due to the additional person that we're adding. Small tools and minor equipment based on inflationary factors. Sanitation, that's one that changed, and that's based on, because we added additional portable toilets at Arc Lake during the summer and at the dog park during the spring and winter. Last year, we added them during the fall and summer, and this year we're adding them for the spring and winter. So the dog park, I believe, will have portable toilets year round.
And those are very much appreciated by the folks that use that park, which, as you might know, it's one of our most popular parks. So having that facility there is a good thing.
Contracted services, we did decrease the instructor fees slightly because we're offering less programs currently that we expect will pick up once the field house is in place, but we kind of shifted gears for the time being. We did also eliminate or reduce some of the revenue that corresponds to that. I think that's pretty much the extent of that department.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that comment. So in the next coming 2 years, the city's going to see a lot of expenses related to the capital costs with the field house. These budgets do not yet reflect any increase in operating costs. So I would expect or anticipate that the FY26 budget 2 years after this process will be reflective of additional staffing needs, additional materials and supplies, new revenue sources as we start to bring that field house online. So it's exciting, and it'll be another change coming down the road.
Okay. On to non-departmental. The insurance, I'll mention that the insurance estimates in here, these are just estimates. We have not yet received our quote back from our insurance carrier for vehicle, property, general liability, workers' comp, any of those. So those are just estimates. They're based on current values, and I believe I included a 10% increase because that's what we're under contract. They shouldn't be increasing it more than 10%. The visitor sitter contract is an increase for CPI based on their contract. As noted when we were in the Human Resources Department, we did move the employee appreciation from this department over to the HR department. That's one change there. One of the bigger changes in this department relates to this miscellaneous payroll expenditures account. And you'll see a line under there that says recruitment expenditures. And that relates to hiring bonuses, relocation assistance, and employee referrals, as mentioned as part of the recruitment and retention strategy discussion. So those are what we anticipated them costing for FY24 and FY25.
Correct. So the 10,000 that's listed in this item as other miscellaneous payroll expenditures, that's an existing expense that had already been in the budget. But the 35,000 that we're calling recruitment expenditures, is our estimate of the additional funds that may be needed to fund the 3 recruitment strategies, which are the hiring bonuses, the relocation expense for difficult to fill positions, and the referral program. So if we stand up a new referral program where employees get paid a small cash stipend for successfully referring someone who hires on with us, that's the total of those 3 programs combined, according to our estimates.
So in future budget years on the recruitment expenditures, once we have something in place, can we break those out?
Yeah, so Melanie and I spent a lot of time thinking about where to budget for these. So without knowing ahead of time which departments will have positions that are going to become vacant that then need us to use those funds, we decided, should we fund amongst all departments or should we fund in this location? And Melanie, didn't we decide that we're going to fund from this location and then transfer to a department if needed? So when we adjust after the end of the year, for example, if there was a specific department that paid out a hiring bonus and a relocation expense after the fact, it will be correctly coded to that specific department. But not knowing ahead of time where those vacancies will occur, we thought non-departmentals was an appropriate starting point for that additional budget if it's needed.
I know it's coming up tomorrow's meeting, but I just happened to be glancing through some of the paperwork. And it looks like the senior citizens are asking for a fairly large increase this year over the 12,700.
So what I asked Melanie to include in this draft is flat funding for the non-departmentals. I think there were 2 of the 4 that requested an increase. They're going to present to the council tomorrow, but in making a decision whether to budget exactly what they requested versus budget status quo, we made the decision to just build into this initial draft status quo funding from last year. So that is correct that there are 2 requests that came in that are requesting an increase in FY24. That would need to be made as an amendment to this existing budget, which holds everyone the same funding from FY23.
The only one I noticed was the senior citizen one.
I'll tell you the other one, included in the back flap of your binder is the individual requests from the non-departmental groups. We wanted to take a look at those before they present.
I've got 5 different ones here,
So-
but I think one of them got duplicated.
No, it actually, I thought that too initially, but one of them, they did a separate request for FY24 and a separate one for FY25, where all the other ones included both in the same letter.
Okay.
Councilmember Hutchings, question?
I heard you say that the Soldotna senior citizens are going to be asking for more money. Are you aware that they lost all their funding from the state by not filling out their grant paperwork correctly and they were denied for 2 years?
Yep, I'm sure we'll hear about that tomorrow then. Kind of like filling out your taxes. If you don't do it, you get in trouble.
Okay, so the rental of airport property, that is a fee that we charge to the general fund for non-aviation use of airport property. It's where Rotary Park lives, it's where our shop lives, and it's a fee that the general fund pays to the airport for those services. And that is increased 2.5% a year, which is similar to what we increase the leases at the airport for other users. The other thing that you'll notice in here is there's a big increase to operating transfers, and that's the transfer out for the field house bonds. So $582,625 in FY24, that's new.
And that's only for the initial tranche of 10 million in bonds that have been issued. And if the city gets the second tranche up to 5 million, that will be an additional expense that'll be amending this budget in whichever fiscal year that's incurred.
I think that's it for non-departmental.
I'll just make 2 more quick comments, Melanie. We left legal services the same from no change in legal fees from FY23. $100,000 is what we'd budgeted, and that's what we've included in FY24 and 25. And we think that that's realistic. There were some additional expenses related to the annexation appeal, and that's ongoing, and we'll continue to see some expenses related to that. Also, the city joining the UCEDA brief, there were quite a bit of legal time devoted to that particular issue. And so we think we took a look at the breakdown and think that flat funding for legal services is an appropriate starting point for FY 24 and 25. The other thing that we didn't change is city lobbyists. So we're currently in the first year of the city having a lobbyist in Juneau. And that contract, we included it at the same amount. If the city wants, city council wants to continue with that service, it's same as prior year in terms of funding in the budget.
I think that wraps up general fund.
So that was all the information we wanted to present today. Thank you so much for your attention and the questions, and thank you to the department heads for your work and for being available. We'd be happy to answer any final questions before we wrap up. Otherwise, the plan will be to start tomorrow at 3 p.m. with the non-departmentals, those nonprofits that were invited to present their requests directly to you. And as soon as that wraps up, we'll continue through the remaining municipal project, or excuse me, the city funds. But we're happy to answer any final questions.
Mr. Carey, any additional questions? Vice Mayor Parker, any additional questions? Ms. Hutchings? And back to Mr. Nelson. Do you have any questions?
And I don't. Thank you for the presentations today.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll thank you very much for the hard work you put into this. I'm sure we'll hear a whole lot more tomorrow, and thank you again. And
So
we'll
are we
conclude.
starting tomorrow with the presentations from, is the visitor center coming? No,
No,
just the folks requesting funding. Is that at the beginning? of
I'll
the meeting?
ask Deputy Clerk DeBill if you could read the order of the nonprofits that were invited to come.
Sure, just 1 second. Let me pull up the agenda.
And Vice Mayor Parker, because we already have an existing contract with the chamber to administer the visitor center, we did not invite them to come. That's just, we're budgeting for the contract, but the other 4 we've invited, and we have a tentative order we'll mention.
So tomorrow, starting at 3, we have Salteshi Trails Association, immediately followed by the Boys and Girls Club of the Kenai Peninsula. Will be followed by the Soldotna Area Senior Citizens, and lastly, the Soldotna Historical Society and Museum. And we've budgeted 10 minutes for each of those presentations currently.
if there's nothing else, then we'll conclude the work session, and we'll see you all tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
Yes, you can leave your book. Right?